I'm not the type of person who picks up strangers. I've watched enough true crime shows and read enough online horror stories to know better. But that night, something about the situation felt different. Urgent, almost. It was a little past midnight, and I was driving along a deserted stretch of highway somewhere in Kansas. The kind of road that feels endless, with only the faint glow of your headlights slicing through the darkness. I'd been on the road for hours, heading home after visiting my parents in Colorado. My mom had recently fallen and broken her arm, so I'd driven out to help her settle back in after her hospital visit. It was a hectic few days of grocery runs, organizing her medications, and making sure she had everything she needed before I left. Now, I was making the long trip back to Missouri, where I lived alone in a quiet little apartment. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, with my favorite podcast playing to keep me awake. Still, the monotony of the drive was starting to wear on me. That's when I saw him. A man standing on the shoulder, illuminated by the beams of my headlights. He was waving one arm, the other clutching what looked like a small backpack. His clothes were dusty, jeans and a faded flannel shirt, and his hair was disheveled. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he looked normal enough. Tired, maybe desperate. My first thought was that he'd run out of fuel, though I didn't see any vehicle nearby. As I slowed down, my mind screamed at me to keep driving. I'd heard all the warnings, all the reasons not to do this, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the sheer isolation of the road, or the thought of leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. Whatever it was, I rolled down the passenger side window just a crack. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Thanks for stopping," he said, stepping closer. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in hours. "Ran out of gas a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated. There wasn't a next town for at least 30 miles, and I knew it. It would be a long, quiet drive with a complete stranger. But leaving him out here didn't sit right with me either. "Where's your car?" I asked, stalling for time. He gestured vaguely behind him. "About 3 miles back. I'd call for help, but He pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up. The screen was cracked, and the battery indicator was flashing red. No service out here anyway. I glanced at the empty road ahead and then back at him. His eyes met mine briefly, and I felt a strange pang of guilt. He looked worn out, like he'd been through the ringer. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. "All right, hop in," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it," he said as he climbed in. He set his backpack on the floor and buckled his seatbelt. "Name's Kevin, by the way." "Evan," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road as I pulled back onto the highway. "So, where are you headed?" "Just trying to get to Salina," he said. "Got family there." That was at least an hour away. I nodded but didn't say much. The silence settled over us, heavy and awkward, broken only by the hum of the engine. Kevin shifted in his seat, glancing out the window. I could feel him watching me occasionally, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. "You're brave," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Not a lot of people would have stopped for someone like me." I forced a chuckle. "Guess I'm just a nice guy." Kevin smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something about him felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he kept fidgeting, or how his gaze lingered on me just a second too long. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, the guy had been stranded in the middle of nowhere. Of course he was nervous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. We drove in silence for a while, the empty highway stretching endlessly ahead. The further we went, the more the tension seemed to grow, like a taut wire ready to snap. Kevin leaned forward, fiddling with the strap of his backpack. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "So, what do you do?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Kevin looked up, startled, like he hadn't expected me to ask. "Oh, odd jobs. Construction, mostly. Been out of work for a bit, though." "Tough break," I said, glancing at him briefly. He nodded, but his expression was unreadable. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd just made the worst decision of my life. The silence between us grew heavier as the miles rolled on, interrupted only by the occasional rattle of loose gravel or the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Kevin seemed to be getting more restless, shifting in his seat and glancing back toward the dark road behind us, as though expecting something or someone. "You said you've got family in Salina?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. The stillness was beginning to unnerve me. "Yeah," he said quickly, like he'd been waiting for the question. "My sister lives there. She's got a place on the south side of town. Figured it was time to visit." I nodded, though something about his answer felt rehearsed, like he'd said it 100 times before. "She know you're coming?" Kevin hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Not exactly. I wanted to surprise her." I tried to keep my face neutral, but I couldn't help wondering about the cracks in his story. No gas, no cell service, a surprise visit to a family member in the middle of the night. None of it added up. But I pushed the thoughts aside. For all I knew, he really was just a guy down on his luck. We passed a green road sign indicating we were still 20 miles from the next exit. The dark emptiness of the surrounding fields stretched on endlessly, and the faint glow of distant stars barely broke through the inky sky. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again out of habit. Nothing but blackness behind us. Kevin shifted again and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You drive this route often?" he asked, his voice low but oddly intent. "Not really," I said. "Just passing through. I live in Missouri, but I was visiting family in Colorado." "Missouri, huh?" He let out a low whistle. "That's a haul. Bet it gets lonely driving all night." I shrugged. "You get used to it." He didn't respond, just nodded and stared out the window again. I glanced at him briefly. He seemed tense, his fingers twitching slightly as they rested on his knees. My stomach tightened. Something about his demeanor had shifted, and it was starting to unsettle me. We passed another mile marker, the reflective numbers catching in the headlights before disappearing into the void. Kevin finally broke the silence again. "You ever get the feeling you're being followed?" I froze for half a second, my grip on the steering wheel tightening instinctively. "What do you mean?" He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Nothing. Just a thought. Feels like someone's out there, watching, you know?" My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Not really," I said, keeping my tone light. "Just the two of us out here." Kevin didn't respond this time. Instead, he turned his attention to his backpack, unzipping it and rummaging inside. The sound of the zipper sent a chill down my spine. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of what he was doing, but he angled the bag away from me, his movements deliberately slow. "What's in the bag?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Kevin paused, his hand still inside the bag. He turned his head toward me, his expression completely blank. "Just some stuff I need," he said. "Clothes, mostly." I nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but my pulse quickened. I didn't believe him. As we approached the exit sign for a small rest area, I made a quick decision. "Hey, I'm going to pull over here for a bit," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Could use a quick stretch and maybe grab something from the vending machine." Kevin glanced at the sign, his expression unreadable. Yeah, sure. That's fine. I signaled and took the ramp, my mind racing. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread tightening around my chest. As I pulled into the rest area, the parking lot's fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow on the empty asphalt. It looked like the place hadn't been used in years. A lone vending machine stood at the entrance to a small, dimly lit restroom building. There were no other machines in sight. I parked next to the machine, close enough for the light to illuminate my truck, but far enough away to keep some distance from the building. Kevin's eyes scanned the area, his expression unreadable. "I'll be there in a minute," I said, reaching for my wallet on the center console. Kevin nodded but didn't move to get out. Instead, he leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on his backpack. "Take your time," he said, his voice casual, but there was a tension in it that I couldn't place. I got out of the car. The night air was colder than I expected. The faint hum of the vending machine was the only sound as I walked toward it, my shoes crunching on the gravel. Excuses for why I had stopped were running through my head. Did I really want a snack? Not really. Did I need a minute to think, to realize what I was getting myself into? Absolutely. As I stood in front of the vending machine, pretending to think about my options, I looked back at the car. Kevin wasn't moving. He was sitting there, his silhouette framed by the interior light, his head turned slightly toward me. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me or just staring into space, but the sight sent shivers down my spine. I randomly pushed the button, and the bag of pretzels clattered through the slot. When I bent down to pick it up, I heard the faint sound of a car engine in the distance. Straightening up, I looked around, but the highway was empty. The sound grew louder and closer until headlights appeared on the horizon, moving in our direction. Then Kevin got out of the car, his movement sudden and purposeful. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and took a few steps toward me. "Do you hear that?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes," I answered, my throat dry. "Probably just another traveler." The headlights of a car flashed over the seating area as it approached, slowing as it neared the entrance. It was an old sedan, its paint faded and its engine rumbling unevenly. However, the driver did not enter the parking lot. Instead, the car lingered at the entrance, idling, its high beams briefly blinding me. Kevin tensed, his posture changed. "We have to go," he said, his voice sharp. "What's the rush?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the knot that had formed in my stomach. "Just, let's go," he said, turning to the car. His insistence was infectious, and I followed him without hesitation. When we got back in the car, the sedan's headlights suddenly turned off, plunging the rest area back into darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I started the engine, the sound of which seemed too loud in the silence of the night. Kevin was already buckled in, his hand tightening on the strap of his backpack. I pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, but the sedan didn't follow me. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting its headlights to turn on again and follow us, but the road remained empty. However, the uneasy feeling in my chest did not disappear. "What was that?" I asked after a few minutes of silence. Kevin didn't answer right away. He was looking out the window, his jaw clenched. "Probably nothing," he finally said. "Just some weirdo. Anything can happen here." "Right," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The silence dragged on, heavier now, the tension in the car palpable. Kevin didn't let go of his backpack, and his eyes darted to the side mirror every few seconds, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. "Listen," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. I'm sorry if I'm making you nervous. It's been a rough night." "It's okay," I lied, forcing a smile. "We're almost to the next town anyway." But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. We reached the next town just as the faint glow of early morning began to creep over the horizon. It was one of those small, middle-of-nowhere places with a single main street, a few scattered houses, and a gas station that doubled as a diner. The neon sign above the gas station buzzed faintly, the word open flickering intermittently. I pulled into the lot and parked near one of the pumps. Kevin shifted in his seat, his gaze darting toward the gas station's entrance. "Need anything?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nah," he said quickly. "Just gonna stretch my legs." I watched him step out of the car, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He looked around nervously, his eyes scanning the empty streets like he was expecting someone to appear at any moment. Something about his behavior set me on edge, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I climbed out and started filling up the tank. The attendant, an older man with a grizzled beard, stepped out of the diner to light a cigarette. He nodded at me but didn't say much. Kevin kept his distance, pacing near the edge of the lot, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the gas station sign. As the pump clicked, signaling a full tank, I turned to Kevin. "You sure you're good? You can grab some food if you want." He hesitated, his hand tightening on the strap of his backpack. "Yeah, I'm good. Let's just get back on the road." I nodded, though I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at me. We climbed back into the car and pulled out onto the highway. The town quickly disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed up by the endless stretch of road ahead. The silence between us felt heavier than ever. Kevin had stopped fidgeting, but his tension was palpable. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his backpack like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "So your sister," I said, breaking the silence. "She expecting you?" Kevin's eyes flicked toward me briefly before returning to the road. "Not exactly. Like I said, I wanted it to be a surprise." "What if she's not home?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "She'll be home," he said firmly. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The way he said it left no room for doubt, but it also didn't feel reassuring. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 5 a.m. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the unease I felt hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was growing stronger. After a few more miles of silence, Kevin spoke again. "You ever feel like you can't trust anyone?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Like everyone's got an angle, even the people who seem nice. You never know what they're hiding." I swallowed hard, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I guess. But most people are just trying to get by, same as anyone else." Kevin let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, maybe." I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet. The miles stretched on, and the tension in the car grew thicker with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin was testing me, that there was something he wasn't telling me. As the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, Kevin shifted in his seat and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Still no service," he muttered. I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet. The miles stretched on, and the tension in the car grew thicker with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin was testing me, that there was something he wasn't telling me. As the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, Kevin shifted in his seat and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Still no service," he muttered. Reluctantly, I slowed the car and pulled over onto the shoulder. Kevin unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack. "Be right back," he said, climbing out of the car. I watched him walk a few yards into the grass, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He glanced over his shoulder once, then disappeared behind a cluster of low bushes. Something about the way he'd looked back at me sent a chill down my spine. My instinct screamed at me to drive off, to leave him there and not look back. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, my heart pounding, waiting for Kevin to return. Kevin was gone longer than I expected. Each minute that passed felt like an hour, and the longer I sat there, the more my nerves began to unravel. My fingers tapped anxiously on the steering wheel as I kept my eyes glued to the spot where he'd disappeared. The highway around me was still eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of grass in the breeze. My gut told me something wasn't right. Why did he need to bring his backpack to take care of whatever it was he'd mentioned? My imagination started conjuring worst-case scenarios, and for the first time, I considered the possibility that I might be in danger. I glanced at the keys still in the ignition. It would be so easy to start the car and drive away, leave him out here and never look back. But as much as my instincts screamed at me to do just that, a small part of me felt guilty. He hadn't done anything explicitly threatening. Not yet, anyway. Still, my unease only grew as the minutes dragged on. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the car door and stepped out, the early morning chill biting through my jacket. "Kevin?" I called, my voice sounding much smaller than I intended. No response. I took a few hesitant steps toward the bushes, straining my ears for any sign of movement. The grass beneath my shoes crunched softly, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. "Kevin, are you all right?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the faint whisper of the wind. My heart was pounding now, the back of my neck prickling with unease. Against my better judgment, I moved closer to the spot where he'd vanished. As I rounded the cluster of bushes, my breath caught in my throat. Kevin was crouched low, his back to me, rummaging through his backpack. I couldn't see what he was doing, but the tension in his posture made my stomach drop. I froze, torn between calling out to him again or retreating to the car as quietly as possible. Before I could decide, Kevin straightened up abruptly, his movements sharp and purposeful. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. In his hands, he held what looked like a weathered map and a small, rusted hunting knife. My blood ran cold. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Kevin's eyes flicked to the map, then back to me. He seemed to realize how the scene must look because his grip on the knife relaxed slightly. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. "Then what is it?" I asked, taking a cautious step back. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know this seems weird, but I promise I'm not trying to scare you. The knife is just for protection. Out here, you never know what you'll run into." "And the map?" I asked, my eyes darting between him and the knife. "It's personal," he said, his voice guarded. "Something I've been working on for a while. A project." His vague answers did nothing to ease my nerves. "We should probably get back on the road," I said, my voice firm. "We're wasting time here." Kevin nodded slowly, folding the map and tucking it back into his backpack. He slipped the knife into the side pocket, where it was still partially visible, and slung the bag over his shoulder. "You're right," he said. "Let's go." We walked back to the car in tense silence, my mind racing with questions. What kind of project required a map and a knife? And why had he been so secretive about it? As we got back on the highway, the atmosphere in the car was thick with unspoken tension. Kevin stared out the window, his expression distant, while I kept my focus on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Thanks for waiting," he said after a while, his voice softer now. I know I've been acting strange. It's just been a long night. Yeah, I replied, not trusting myself to say more. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the fields as we sped past. But despite the growing light, I couldn't shake the darkness that seemed to hang over us. Something about Kevin's story didn't add up, and I had a sinking feeling that I'd only scratched the surface of whatever was really going on. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the soft light of the early morning. The tension in the car was almost suffocating, and my grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles had turned white. Kevin's earlier behavior replayed in my mind on a loop. The knife, the map, the vague answers. None of it made sense. Kevin had gone quiet again, staring out the window as if lost in thought. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, trying to gauge his mood. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw set. He looked calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was anything but. "How much further?" Kevin asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "About 20 miles, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He nodded but didn't say anything else. The quiet stretched on, broken only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. My nerves were frayed, and I found myself wishing for the drive to be over, for Kevin to be out of my car and out of my life. As we neared the outskirts of Salina, the scenery began to change. Fields gave way to scattered houses, and the faint outlines of buildings appeared in the distance. My relief was short-lived, though, as Kevin suddenly straightened in his seat, his entire demeanor shifting. "Pull over here," he said abruptly. I frowned, glancing at the road ahead. We were still a few miles from the town center, and there wasn't much around us. "Why?" "Just pull over," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, I slowed the car and eased onto the shoulder. Kevin unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack, moving with a sense of urgency that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "Thanks for the ride," he said, opening the door. "I'll walk the rest of the way." I stared at him, confused. "Are you sure? We're almost there." "Yeah," he said, stepping out of the car. "This is close enough." Before I could respond, he slammed the door and started walking toward a narrow dirt path that led into a cluster of trees. I watched him go, torn between relief and a lingering sense of dread. He didn't look back, his pace steady and determined. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to wait or drive away. Part of me wanted to follow him, to demand answers to the questions that had been swirling in my mind since I'd picked him up. But another part of me, the smarter part, knew it was better to leave well enough alone. With a deep breath, I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway. As the town came into view, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Kevin was no longer my problem. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. By the time I reached the first gas station in Salina, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to tell someone about what had happened. I parked near the entrance and walked inside, the cool air of the store a welcome contrast to the warmth of the morning sun. The clerk, a young guy with a bored expression, looked up as I approached the counter. "Morning," he said, barely glancing at me. "Morning," I replied, my voice sounding distant even to myself. "Listen, has anyone reported anything strange around here recently? Like someone acting suspicious?" The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Not that I've heard. Why?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I picked up a hitchhiker outside of town. Guy named Kevin. He was acting kind of weird. Just thought someone should know." The clerk's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Kevin, huh? Did he have a backpack?" "Yeah," I said, my stomach dropping. "You know him?" The clerk nodded slowly. He's been around here before. Folks say he's looking for something. Don't know what, but he's harmless. Just a little off, you know. Harmless. The word echoed in my mind, but it did little to ease my unease. I nodded and thanked the clerk before heading back to my car. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I couldn't stop thinking about Kevin's parting words, the knife, the map, and the way he'd disappeared into the trees without a second glance. I'll probably never know what Kevin was really up to that night or what he was looking for. But one thing is certain, I won't be picking up another hitchhiker anytime soon. If you like these stories, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Thank you for watching.